Irish Nation, welcome to the show. Mike and I are on a recording marathon here. We're teeing up, 6, 7, 8 really great shows for y'all with one segment, shorter, more digestible. Get them in on your commutes. Go like us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, wherever you get your podcast. Send it to a friend. And Mike, this is one of my favorite show of the year where we get to really bring all of our advanced analytics, all of the stats we talk about into season-ending grades. It's finals week coming up in Notre Dame, and this is our version of handing out our final exams for Marcus Freeman and the football program.
Yeah, excited to dive into these grades. We obviously do our preseason grades, and for that, we're really just basing everything off of projections, expectations, what we're hearing on the beat. And it is interesting seeing how those predictions will vary based on what actually happens. For this, I think we feel more confident with the grades that we give because we're actually basing it on the performance that happened throughout the entire year. Real data, not projections. So with that, I'm going to dive into what our grading scale is. It's the same scale that we've used in the past. An A+, that means top 10. So that's really what we would call kind of elite or near elite, depending on how you want to cut it. An A- is around top 25. B range is 25 to 50. C range is outside the top 50. D and below is outside the top 100. And then I suppose if hypothetically we were around dead last, we'd probably give them an F. But I think, Brett, before we dive in, since we're doing our season scorecard, I kind of want to give myself a little season scorecard. So when we
Take
started
it away.
the season,
You earn it.
When we started the season, we gave our record predictions, and I have to get my flowers here from Brett right now. But I predicted 11-1, and for that one loss, I'll admit I didn't predict NIU. I said that we would have a letdown performance against someone. I think I was kind of hinting it would be someone like Louisville. I don't think anyone thought that we'd possibly lose to NIU. So I think it's like when I stack those together, 11-1, letdown performance against a team that we shouldn't. I feel like that was a pretty good result. I predicted a top 5 defense, which we were around a top 5 defense. And then I think one of my more aggressive predictions was that I thought we would actually perform, our offense would step up and we'd perform at a top 10 level. So look, these predictions aren't going to always play out like this every year, but from that standpoint, this year I was able to kind of, I think, get these about as accurate as possible. So this was from a prediction standpoint, one of my better years.
Absolutely. And look, Notre Dame was 9-2-1 against the spread this year. And I think in general, we were pretty bullish on Notre Dame beating spreads. I know in prior seasons, we actually would do better. We should do this next year again, do better at tracking your score predictions and my score predictions.
Yeah.
And seeing how often we were spot on, how often we were correct against the spread or not. But certainly I think our predictions game by game this year were pretty much in line with thinking that Vegas was not giving Notre Dame enough credit, particularly after that NIU game. Notre Dame ends the year 9-2-1 against the spread, and I think in general that would have lined up nicely with us as well. So, Mike, you certainly take the cake in the class this year with the best grade between the two of us, but I think our predictive analytics here are starting to fine-tune as well. We're going to switch back and forth among the grading by position groups, a quarterback, running back, receiver, etc., and then offense and defense as a whole. And as we've discussed in the past, if every unit on offense was a B, that could actually come together to form an A or an A- or an A+ as an offensive unit. But this year, I don't think we actually have a lot of those exceptions. I think in general, pretty darn solid position groups, and no surprise how that comes together for the team as a whole. So that's a little preview to where things are going. Of course, Notre Dame's in the college football playoff. That makes you one of the top 12 teams. And so we should be talking like an A+ team because we are. We are contenders in the college football playoff. We have a chance to go win a championship. So first and foremost, that's really the context for every grade we give out. Let me start with quarterback play. Riley Leonard. We had a grade on Riley of an A- for the season as a whole. And that's kind of a B+ passer. But when you factor in that dual threat running, really another running back on the field, it made that overall package an A-. I was really contemplating, is this actually more like an A? But I think that overall passing, he was number 34 in Pro Football Focus passing grade. We've talked a lot on this show about struggles under pressure when other quarterbacks or when other defenses would get after the quarterback. Leonard's production drops off way more than expectation. And I don't think there was a game this year where you looked and said Notre Dame won it because Riley Leonard was passing the football. He wasn't out there winning games for us. And so, very winning games, to be clear, with his arm. So, very, very productive quarterback. We said top 25 is A minus, that 25 to 50 is in the B range. Well, if he's the number 34th graded quarterback, again, a little subjective according to Pro Football Focus, but that started us in that BB plus range. Why did we move him up to an A minus? 66% completion rate, 3-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio, and then really a slow start against Texas A&M and Northern Illinois. In fact, those were his two worst Pro Football Focus grades on the season. But down the stretch, multiple passing touchdowns in 5 of the last 6 games. 3 of his best graded games were in the last 5 games of the season. So really, as you want him performing well as the season goes on, you really saw him peaking at the right time. And then his legs, 760 yards rushing this year, 14 touchdowns on the ground, 14 rushing touchdowns to go with his 16 passing touchdowns, accounting for 30 touchdowns overall. Yeah, that's A minus territory for the QB at Notre Dame. So overall, great year for Riley Leonard. Great job protecting the football, great job avoiding sacks, and really the dual threat package we were looking for, particularly as the season went along. A big part of the reason why Notre Dame's 11-1.
Definitely. And I think with Leonard, just the improvement is such a key factor here. While, yeah, B plus passer for the whole year, I think if you're looking for upside in the playoffs, I think there's real reason to believe that hopefully he can play more in A minus. I'm not going to say A, but maybe he can kind of perform more at an A minus level as we get further into the playoffs. Moving to the next position group, this is a fun one. This is one that we had high hopes for coming into the season. I can't remember exactly what grade we gave it. I don't know if we gave it an A plus, but I think certainly we were very bullish on this position group going in, and that's the running back room. And so this team, I mean, this position group really, I think it's one that really flew off the screen when you watched. Just very stunning plays. I mean, you have someone like Love just hurdling people. You have big runs. We were number 4 in the Pro Football Focus grades. So in terms of what we were doing on film when it was being evaluated by scouts, film evaluators, they really liked what they saw. They saw this as one of the best running back groups in the country. In terms of run explosiveness, I mentioned that these were really the types of plays that flew off the screen when you're watching the games. We were the best team in the country at that. Number 1 in run explosiveness. And any given play, there was a chance that we could just house it. And we saw that time and time again this year. And then on top of that, we also, our running backs play in, play out, they demonstrated a consistency in terms of their yardage per carry that also puts this position group at the top. So as a team, we had 4 yards per carry after contact. So after our running backs got hit, like the yardage that you get before contact, a lot of that is attributable to what the offensive line is doing. But once our running backs actually got hit, they were able to get 4 more yards from that point, which is extremely impressive. And they actually generated 6.7 yards per attempt overall. So when Brett and I talk about things like success rate, a lot of times that's getting more than half the yard, getting like 5 or 6 yards on first down, more than half of the remaining yards after that, and then converting on 3rd and 4th down. If you're getting 6.7 yards per attempt overall, and again, some of this is driven by that run explosiveness, but if you're doing that, that's telling you that you have a running back room that's keeping you on schedule from a success rate standpoint. I'm going to spit out some other individual stats here for Price and Love, but for running backs with at least 80 carries, that translates to Jadarian Price being number 9 in yards per attempt and Love number 14. So that's really a two-headed monster. And I'm not even talking about Riley Leonard at all. We covered that in the last position group. So from just a running attack standpoint, it's a really tough position group to handle. Love had 15 touchdowns. And I think if not for Giante from Boise State, I think he very much would have been an All-American candidate. And we're going to have him next year. So I think Love is someone who's going to have really high hopes next year. Probably you'll probably see his name listed on some Heisman Trophy lists going into next season, I would expect. And look, I think one thing that also impacts Love's stats a bit, it's also something that keeps him fresh, a little bit more fresh throughout the year. Obviously, he's a little banged up right now, but because we have Price, who's an extremely effective back, we don't have to give every carry to Love. We have 2 guys who can really effectively carry the ball, generate run explosiveness, generate successful run plays time in, time out, and it keeps Love from maybe generating Heisman Trophy level stats, but it keeps both of them fresh and puts us in a better position as the year goes down to not have this position group get worn down.
I think the other stat that has always stood out to me about Jeremiah Love, and frankly, it's the same for Jadarian Price too, but just how many missed tackles they force. So, Jeremiah Love forced 56 missed tackles this year. Overall, that was the 21st most missed tackles forced among running backs in college football. But every person except for one other player on the 20 running backs ahead of him just had way more carries than Love because they weren't splitting it with Jadarian Price and Riley Leonard. So, for example, Jeremiah Love average breaking at least one tackle on 42% of his carries. Ashton Jeanty is 39%. He led the nation in broken tackles, but it was only on 39% of his carries. And Boise State was not playing the defenses that Notre Dame was when you think about strength of schedule and who's trying to tackle Jeremiah Love versus who's trying to tackle Ashton Jeanty out in the Mountain West. Another example, Cam Scatabo, the big Arizona State running back who rushed for 1,600 yards, 19 touchdowns, just had a great season for Arizona State. He broke 89 tackles, but on 264 carries. And so his missed tackle rate is only about 33% of the time compared to Jeremiah Love's 42%. So, I mean, just the elusiveness out of Love and trying to bring him to the ground. Not arguably, I mean, the data just says the best in the country when you adjust for the number of carries he has. So, can't agree more. A+ season for Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price, and that running back room. Moving to wide receivers and tight ends. We graded this out as a C+. That would imply we're saying this is outside the top 50, somewhere in that 50 to 100 range. And it might be a little harsh, but this was the weakness on the roster. And I think there's some areas where, frankly, we could have made this grade lower too. Pro Football Focus, again, pretty subjective in some of their grading. Some of their grading, like tackling, just looks at missed tackle rate. Some of their grading, like receivers, it's a little more kind of subjective, but 48th in the Pro Football Focus grades. If you look at passing play explosiveness, we were number 129 out of 134 teams. So for as explosive as we were in the run game, there just wasn't a big pass game threat. And I think that was a pretty big Achilles heel for this Notre Dame team throughout the year. I think it's something I'm continuing to monitor in the college football playoff. We had 21 drops on the year. This offense wasn't designed to highlight wide receivers. We knew there wasn't a true number one target. But at the end of the day, Riley Leonard was completing 66% of his passes despite the drops. Like he, struggled earlier in the year with accuracy, but really for the last 9-10 games of this season, Riley Leonard was putting the ball on the money, and no player stepped up and had over 450 yards receiving on the season. No player stepped up and had more than 3 receiving touchdowns. And I thought the most shocking stat going through this that to me just really highlighted why this is the weakness on the team. 0 games with a 100-yard receiver this season. Not once did a Notre Dame player individually have more than 100 yards receiving in a game. The most was Bo Collins had 85, I believe, against Stanford. And so there's some other reasons to this. Mitch Evans was a potential All-American tight end a year ago. He was recovering from an ACL injury and clearly looked like he needed time to round into form. Other guys like Faison, Jaden Thomas, Jane Greathouse, were battling not season-ending injuries, but they were battling some injuries throughout the year and didn't really always have that healthiest room, knowing it already wasn't an area of strength. So there's reason to believe this unit can keep getting better and better. But I thought very clearly the weakest group on either offense or defense. Again, second year in a row. We've covered that ad nauseum on the show, but C+. And I think some reason to believe it's getting better, some reason to believe it's getting healthier. When we're saying Riley Leonard is having his best games at the end of the year, that means the receivers are too. So we think it's a group trending in the right direction. But one of the weakest grade we'll hand out today.
Yeah, I think Mitchell Evans continuing to show progress, getting back to normal, which it seemed like he was the last couple games. That's big. Even Faison and Greathouse, I feel like they in particular were looking better in those last couple games. It's an interesting position group because I think going into this season. We expected them to be better than our wide receiver group last year, but that's not saying a whole lot because our wide receiver group last year was very weak. And I can't remember exactly what we graded them out as. It might have been around I think preseason we might have given them like a B or something like that. And like I said, I think we were optimistic that there would be improvement. And look, I think there was improvement, but we did call out that we thought that maybe some of the Notre Dame beat was a bit too optimistic with some of these transfer wide receivers. And that, again, while we were optimistic, we wouldn't be stunned if they that some of these acquisitions underperformed, and that's what we ended up seeing. They're trending the right way, but a C plus is not. I think going into the season, that's certainly a disappointing grade, and we definitely hope for more. Moving on to the offensive line, I grade out this group as an A minus, and you can make an argument that it's closer to an A, particularly with how they've been trending, closer to an A than a B plus. And look, there's some caveats you need to mention with this room. This is a position group that dealt with a lot of injuries this year. You had Ashton Craig, he had a season-ending injury. Jagasaw, he had a season-ending injury. Billy Strouth, he was out for many games this year. So this is a group that had to deal with a significant number of injuries. And they had their good games, they had their bad games, but I think as the season went on, this is a position group that got better and better and really became an asset by the end of the year. I think that was a key takeaway to the point where when I'm looking to next season, I'm really excited about what we have in this group. I think, look, they were named Joe Moore Award finalists. That's the award for the best offensive lines in the country. So just making that tells you how, I guess, elite talent evaluators, people who are looking at all the offensive lines in the country and trying to stack up who are the best. That tells you they have a lot of respect for this position group. From a run block standpoint, this was actually one of the more effective units we've had in a while. Pro Football Focus graded them out as 11th. They had 3.7 yards before contact as a team. That's largely generated by the offensive line. That's just telling you how much push they got. In terms of line yards, which is a little bit different than yards before contact, but pretty similar, that's pretty much a more direct evaluation of the push the offensive line is getting. We ranked number 29, and this is not a stat that's opponent adjusted. So this tells you that our offensive line was, particularly by the end of the year, they were doing our running backs, a pretty big service, giving them space to run the ball. And our pass blocking, it's interesting. So this is an area where Brett and I sometimes we will not necessarily agree with the grades from Pro Football Focus. Pro Football Focus grades our pass blocking is 70th. Again, this isn't opponent adjusted, but I thought that was a little harsh because the havoc allowed for our team, again, this is not opponent adjusted, was number 10. So across the entire country, look, there are a lot of things that drive how much havoc you're allowing, but a big part in particular, I think, falls on the offensive line. So if you're top 10 in that stat, that tells you that even if you have a quarterback that's very mobile and helping limit some of these big negative plays, you definitely have to give credit to the offensive line. They only allowed 6 sacks. Important to note that when I say 6 sacks, these are the sacks that are directly attributable to the offensive line. So this doesn't include sacks that are allowed by a tight end, a running back, or if they're blitzes where there wasn't a missed block. We actually had 11 sacks on the season, but 6 were only attributable to the offensive line. Even if you have Lamar Jackson out there, like it'd be tough to not allow more sacks than that if you don't have an offensive line performing at an extremely high level. So I think they got better as the year went on. The interior pass block grades, I thought that part of the offensive line in particular performed really well. Some of the pressures that we allowed. So I would say if there was an area from a pass blocking standpoint that we were a little leakier, it tended to be from Wagner and Knapp. And those are some of our younger offensive linemen. So that's not too surprising. And as I mentioned, the injuries, yeah, I alluded to them being young, but I'm going to call that out directly. This is a very young offensive line team. So we should have everyone back next year. And I mentioned that this is a group that I will be very excited about moving forward because it's a team that became, like, as I mentioned, a real asset for us moving forward. They peaked at the right time, and they're peaking for us as we move into the college football playoff.
Overall for the offense, A+. The number we will always look at is SP+. That adjusts for who you're playing, that adjusts for play-by-play data. And we were number 6 in the country in SP+. We scored 39.8 points per game. A lot of that you can attribute to great defense and, special teams and, other things contributing to that. But that's number 3 in the country. It is the most points scored by a Notre Dame offense ever in the history of our program. And I get it. Modern college football, higher scoring games, more points are being scored. So, of course, this is the era when scoring records are set. but last year set that record, and ND breaks it again with Mike Denbrock. And when we talked about Jared Parker's offenses would overperform against the worst of the schedule versus, then underperform against the most difficult tests, Denbrock's teams went out and did what they needed to do offensively, regardless of the opponent they were playing. Of course, we put up more points against Purdue than we did A&M, but really, after that slow start against A&M and NIU, Denbrock figured it out. This unit gelled and went and just won football games with great balance. Number 31st in success rate at staying on schedule, number 23 in explosiveness to generate big plays, and number 10 in havoc allowed, just not letting defenses disrupt us. That is a recipe for success for Notre Dame football. And really, I thought the biggest surprise of this team, we were wondering, could we elevate from a top 25, top 30 offense to a top 20 offense? You and I debated this. I think you had more optimism it could be a top 10 unit than I did in the preseason. And it sure is very squarely a top 10 unit at number 6 in SP+. So A+ overall for Mike Denbrock. I think everything Notre Dame fans were hoping to get out of that offensive coordinator hire showed up. Mike, you want to kick us over to the defense?
The defensive line for us, we graded them out as an A-. Similar to the offensive line, this is a position group that had to deal with their share of injuries. But they did not, even with those injuries, they remained effective throughout the entire year. And I think one area that they were a little weaker in at the beginning of the season was generating havoc. I remember we called that out in some of our early episodes. But then once we opened up Pandora's box and the havoc came out, it was really there to stay. And that was a theme from that point on. So in terms of havoc generated, this was a unit that was very effective at generating havoc. We were number 28 in the country at 19%. And as I mentioned, there were a couple games early on where we weren't generating a whole lot. So this is more back end weighted, which is exactly what you would want to see as you're moving into the postseason. Tells you that this is a group that's trending in the right direction. The Pro Football Focus, they agree. They graded out our pass rush as number 30. So not surprising if you're generating a lot of havoc on the as a team defensively. A lot of that's going to be driven by the pass rush, and Pro Football Focus tells us that's exactly what happened here. Look, I think if we had stayed completely healthy, there was probably potential for them to be an A. And I think the fact that we were able to maintain an A- level with all the injuries, I think that's something that's, I think that's an impressive accomplishment for this unit. It also speaks to the depth that we have on this team. And then even just outside of the pass rush, this is a unit that defended pretty well against the run overall. Look, there were certainly moments in certain games where teams were able to run the ball a little bit, but we only allowed 2 100-yard rushers, and it was the 2 triple option QBs. No running back had a 100-yard game against ND. That's a little arbitrary. NIU had the running back had 99 yards and 100 plus receiving yards. So that cutoff actually works extremely well here, but the fact still remains. And in terms of the guys who really drove this, it's the people that we expected. So Riley Mills, 33 pressures, 7 sacks, only 1 missed tackle all year, impact player, and someone who definitely has been surging as the year has gone on. Howard Cross, only 1 missed tackle all year. He's banged up right now, but we're optimistic that he's going to be good to go by the time we get to the playoff. And outside of those guys, there's a little bit of everyone. This is a unit that generated 39 sacks, so extremely disruptive. Even though they had injuries to Patello, Traore, they were able to have the next person step up and play well enough to where there wasn't a big enough drop off for this unit. So as I said, grade is A- here, but I think when you also factor in how many injuries they had, I think this is you really got to give the coaching staff and the depth of this unit a lot of credit as well.
I love the defensive grades more than the offense because the stats are so black and white. Like, do you tackle? Do you generate pressure? Do you allow targets to become catches when you're in coverage? Versus the grades for a receiver of whether or not the ball was thrown their way, or for a quarterback of was it the receiver, the quarterback, or, was it pushed from the offensive line, or was it the quarterback holding it too long? Like, it's a little more gray and subjective on the offensive side. I think seeing that havoc rate at 19% just means you're being a constant motor on the defensive line, generating pressure. It's hard to say that metric lies, right? Same thing at linebacker. This is a group that is just a flat out A, and I could argue they're A+. In fact, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and arbitrarily change it right now. The linebackers are an A plus this year because the number one stat that we look at for our linebackers is their tackling rate. And our missed tackle rate was number 7 in the country. Jack Kaiser and Drake Bowen were our 2 leading tacklers who had a missed tackle rate of 4% and 5%. The best team in the country is going to be around 10% just as a team. They were 4% and 5% as our leading tacklers, like the ones that are making the tackles in open space, the ones that are trying to run down tight ends, trying to run down running backs, and they just don't make mistakes and are tackling machines. Even guys like Jaden Osbury and Jalen Sneed are kind of, if you will, tier 2. It's impossible to even call these guys tier 2. Their missed tackle rates were 13% and 12%. If we weren't talking about Kaiser and Bowen, we would say those are 2 of the best tackling linebackers as a tandem on any other team in the country. They would love to have Osbury and Sneed with 13% and 12% missed tackle rates. And they're our 3rd and 4th best linebackers statistically. Just a deep unit. Really now outside of Kaiser, a young unit. Like I'm so excited about the 3-headed monster of Bone and Osbury and Sneed going to next year. We're not even talking about the rest of the room beyond those guys. And it shows up in the same thing you said about the defensive line. Only 200-yard rushers this year, and there were 2 triple option quarterbacks. So no running back had a 100-yard game against Notre Dame. I think it's a big credit to the front 7, both the defensive line and the linebackers. Mike, I'm really jealous you get to cover the secondary, but I know we're going in order. So before you go, I'm just going to say Ben Morrison is my favorite player in like Notre Dame football history. Certainly while covering it on the show. Really jealous you get to cover it, but I think Garish Talk Nation probably knows my view on what the secondary grade is.
Yeah, I'll allow it. Now look, I think this game of eeny, meeny, miny, mo that we're playing with the position groups definitely worked out in my favor. When I realized I was doing the secondary, I think I had the opposite reaction of you. You're like, oh darn, I'm missing the ability to give out grades for one of the best position groups we've ever seen.
And you get Jeremiah Love. That's not you get Jeremiah Love and the secondary. I mean, come on.
I get the fun ones. Yeah, you got the receivers. So yeah, hey, but I think it's fair. Like we talked about how I think
this is
my grade.
Grade.
My grade as an analyst this year, I think, is an A plus. So I think it's fair that I get to call out the highest graded position groups. But needless to say, this group is an A plus, which is remarkable given where our secondary has been at different points in the past. I remember not that long ago, our corners, and I guess really not our safeties as much, but our corners in particular were really a weakness in a lot of matchups. But it really, Mickens has done a phenomenal job. This has become one of the strongest position groups, not even just this year, but that we've had on any Notre Dame team. So obviously an A plus. Pro Football Focus coverage grade number 2. Again, that's not even opponent adjusted. So that's just telling you that regardless of who we're playing, it's just like the technique is perfect. Our corners are constantly in the right position. They're making big plays on the ball. Not surprising that our pass success rate allowed, it was number 1 in the entire country, 26%. Again, not opponent adjusted. So it's if a team, like even teams that played much weaker schedules than us, weren't even able to put up the headline stats that we're putting up in these categories. Only 3 times did an opposing quarterback top 150 yards. And then just diving into some of these Pro Football Focus stats we were able to get on the secondary, they're always so interesting to dive in because they just paint a very consistent picture of how dominant our secondary is. Our top 7 most targeted secondary players in terms of targets only allowed 5 touchdowns and 13 interceptions this season. That's a very impressive ratio. It's like you're probably not going to get many touchdowns on us. Odds are you're going to be getting, you're going to be throwing interceptions when you're going up against our secondary. And then completion percentage allowed, Moore only allowed a 47% completion percentage, Morrison 44%, Watts, Clark, and Gray all around 55%. All these stats just tell you that we're really not allowing opposing quarterbacks and receivers to generate successful passing plays. And in fact, when they're attempting it, occasionally we'll give a touchdown, but odds are you're probably throwing it right into our hands. And as we saw against USC, sometimes that actually turned out to be a pick 6. So just going to reiterate, one of the most dominant units that we've ever covered. And that's even with some injuries too. We had Ben Morrison hurt for a lot of the year. And the freshman Leonard Moore stepped up and looks like the next big stud in that cornerback room. So look, we'll get into it more later in terms of like the depth, if that's something to keep an eye on as we go forward. But in terms of the performance that this unit put together and the people that we have starting and the people who are in the rotation, this is one of the best units of any position group, I think, across all of college football.
So coming to the defense as a whole, A plus. We've talked about this as one of the greatest defenses in college football. I could argue it is the best defense in college football. Of course, we're biased, but number 6 in SP plus, number 3 in the country in points allowed per game at 13.6, and really before USC was right there. The only two teams with a lower points per game in Notre Dame history since the Lou Holtz era was the 88 team and the 2012 team, and they were both right around 13 points per game. So this is up there with one of the all-time great Notre Dame defenses. Number 3 in success rate allowed at 34%. Like, offenses need that number around 50%. They need every other play to be staying on schedule. Notre Dame's every third play. And explosiveness allowed. It's really hard to say, hey, we're going to keep you off schedule and take away the home run threat. We were number 5 in explosiveness allowed. Really, really rare to see that combination of an elite success rate and elite explosiveness. It's just hard to take it all away. Usually, if you try to take away that kind of constant 4, 5, 6 yard gain, you're maybe exposing yourself in the back end of big plays, and just absolutely elite defense. Like, I can't think of a coordinator hire that has worked out as well as Al Golden has. And I just hope he's on our sideline for decades to come. It feels like he maybe isn't a guy that wants to get back into the head coaching roles. He's done that already in his career and didn't really go well. I don't think he really enjoyed it. And so who knows? Like, there's a ton of money being thrown at you to be a head coach, but as long as Notre Dame can have Al Golden as defensive coordinator, just enjoy what is going out on the field, because a phenomenal job here the last several years. And I think this is his best defense yet, despite, again, as you mentioned, some really critical injuries. Like, we lost 3 opening day starters on this defensive side of the football, including our best player. Like, Ben Morrison is hands down the best player on the team. And we still go and just rattle off dominating defensive performances. Awesome stuff getting to cover that side of the football this year.
Yep. And then just to round everything out, I'm going to quickly cover the special teams. So I think you have to make a distinction here between our kicking, particularly our field goal kicking, and then everything else. So I think the everything else category, so that's fakes, coverage, field goal blocks, phenomenal. Honestly, one of the better seasons I've seen from that standpoint. So incredible. The kicking game, maybe one of the worst seasons I've seen. But another caveat you got to make here is that our kicker has been hurt. So I think it's pretty tricky to grade special teams, because I would say A plus on probably on a lot of these things. But then for the kicking field goal standpoint, I would say that's probably more of an F. So I guess if we combine all of this and we just do it on a pass fail grading scale, I think it's probably a pass. And I think part of the reason I'm more inclined towards a pass is that for the part that we're failing, there is hope that we have a fix. And I think that's that Mitch Jeter gets fully healthy, that he gets into the right place mentally. We have a couple weeks where he has an opportunity to get there. Unfortunately, we're not really going to know until kickoff. But I think that you got to believe that if we were starting to kind of put him into in-game situations as the season went on, a few more weeks of rest, he should hopefully be in a good position. And Brett, I'm going to take the team grade right here, just because I think it's only fitting.
All
right?
you.
So the team, I think this team gets an A plus. We talked about where we stacked up on offense, on defense. We're number 9 in SP plus. That's where it stacks out. This is a very balanced team that is essentially elite units on both sides of the ball. And I think one important thing to keep in mind here is that, yes, we're number 9, but number 9 is not the same in every year. So you could be number 9, but you have a very, very dominant number 1, number 2, number 3 teams, and there's a massive gap. And this year, that's not really the case. We're number 9, but the advanced metrics would tell you we're actually pretty close to those top teams. We're right in the mix. So I think when you look at it from that standpoint, it's yes, we're top 10, but I don't think that necessarily tells you all the information that you need. Because really, we're number 9, but we're really kind of in the midst of a bunch of top contenders, a mix of contenders, any of whom I think could win the national title this year. So I believe that this is a team that is probably about the closest that we've been. This brought us the closest to the top of the sport that we've been really since I've been a fan of this team.
Absolutely. So Notre Dame, A plus for Marcus Freeman in his 3rd year. And don't forget, like, in September, he was rightfully on the hot seat, at least with folks like us for losing that NIU game and harkening back to losing to Stanford and Marshall. And you're like, look, recruiting's going well. We're winning big games. We're competitive. But how do you lose these boneheaded games? And we said, we think Marcus Freeman needs to run the table in order to exonerate in the regular season, in order to exonerate that NIU loss. And that's exactly what they went out and did. 11-1 at Notre Dame every single time is going to be A minus, A plus effort. And so massive credit to Marcus Freeman now. Feels like we are really, really humming as a program. It's pretty hard to see, like, even looking ahead to next year, like, look, weird things happen in football. Could we be 9-3, 8-4? But like, the program is about as stable as you could possibly hope it could be. And that's just a massive credit to what Freeman's doing for this program overall, really on all fronts: offense, defense, special teams, recruiting, player development, NIL, transfer portal. Like, there are things we would love for Notre Dame to open up undergrad recruiting. We would love for Notre Dame to open up more undergrad transfers and not just relying on, grad transfers in the transfer portal. And it sounds like a lot of those things are in the works. So a program moving in the right direction, a program that's operating like a top 10 team and not just squeaking into playoffs. But I think really for the first time since the early 90s, you can look at this Notre Dame team and say, yep, they belong. They have a shot in these games to go play and do something special here. As we've talked about on prior episodes, the sixth best odds to win a national championship going into the college football playoff. So we'll be back. We've got a lot more playoff coverage, the IU game, what it all means for Notre Dame's path, not just in the first round, but within this field of 12. Until then, Irish beat Hoosiers.
Irish beat Hoosiers.